Okay, so Gamescom's going on right now, and you may or may not have just seen or watched the live stream of AMD announcing two new RX graphics cards for their Radeon lineup, and we're talking the 7700 XT as well as the 7800 XT, which has some of the middle of the ground graphics cards aimed at 1440p and more notably NVIDIA square in the crosshairs. So let's talk about some of the specs, let's talk about pricing, and this one might be a little bit of breath of fresh air that this industry desperately needs. The Air 903 Max mid-tower case from Montech features a 51% porosity ventilation rate, pre-installed HP 140mm ARGB fans, and 21 built-in RGB modes for a premium feel without the premium price. Not interested in RGB? Then the Air 903 base is just for you with its clean aesthetic and incredible component support at a price that won't have you crying. To see the full list of Air 903 specs from Montech, follow the link in the description below. Okay, so let's go and start with the 7800 XT. That card is aimed smack dab at the RTX 4070, but it's doing it at a much lower price point. Now the RTX 4070 non-TI, as you know, comes in at $600 or $599 USD. Now, if we compare the pricing of the 6800 XT, that was a $649 graphics card. So technically it was $50 more than what the RTX 4070 costs today. And that is also in like 3 year ago money, which as we know, the cost of things 3 years ago does not, you can't compare that to today. Everything's more expensive. Raw materials, copper, solder, the dyes, everything is more expensive at a raw material level. So you gotta keep that in mind when we talk about pricing moving forward. It sucks, but it is what it is. But the RX 7800 XT costs $499. Now, one of the things AMD would typically do in the past, I'm starting with pricing because realistically, that is the most important thing people care about. It's like, okay, it can game, it can do this, it can do that, whatever, it might cook me dinner. Can it be affordable for me? $499 is going to be an extremely competitive price point for an 800 moniker graphics card. So yeah, 7800 XT at $499. If these charts even hold remotely true in terms of how it's performing, it is going to be a better love story than Twilight. And I think that meme is a little outdated, but I'm still gonna use it because I have gray hair and that gives me a pass. Okay, so let's talk about the specs of the 7800 XT. Their charts do not show it directly related, like side by side with the 4070, even though we know that that's where they're targeting. In fact, they're a little light on comparisons with NVIDIA product, and this is something they did with the 7900, and it led to a lot of speculation. AMD was very open. They're like, hey, we don't want to just compare ourselves to the competition. We want to put ourselves out there. Here's the performance, and then the consumer is welcome to compare it themselves or the reviewers or whatever. But anyway, it's got 60 unified RDNA 3 compute units. It's 60 RT accelerators, and it's our second gen RT core or RT accelerator, as you probably know by now. 120 AI accelerators. Now that's going to be when it comes to like their FSR 2.1, 2.0, 2.1 and all that. So their AI accelerators is like the FSR stuff or the upscaling. It's got 2124 megahertz game clock and a boost clock at 2430, 16 gigabytes of GDDR6 at 256 bus for 19.5 gigabit per second memory speed, 64 megabytes of second gen Infinity Cache, and DisplayPort 2.0 and AV1 hardware encoding, yes, and 263 watt TDP. So it's a little bit more power hungry than NVIDIA's kind of counterpart has been, and we've sort of shown that this generation for AMD is a little bit more power hungry at that mid-range card. But it's running two 8-pin PCI Express ports, not a 16 high power volt melter connector thingy. So that should be fine. When we talk about the 7700 though, it's not that far behind it. And this is where the 7700 being with the 4060 Ti, like right in its crosshairs, at 54 unified RDNA 3 compute units, 54 RT accelerators. So it's not that far behind spec-wise from the 7800 XT. It's not a huge gap. But it's got a little bit higher core clock because it's not quite as dense. So it's a 2171 megahertz core clock with a 2544 boost clock. So game clock and core clock are kind of the same thing. Boost clock is just the highest that the frequency can go based on its load. Games tend to be a little bit lower actually when they're under load. But it's a 192-bit memory bus. and it's 12 gigabytes of memory. So if you remember, the 4060 Ti has a 16 gigabyte model, which is only available through AICs, which are like MSI, Gigabyte, ASRock, not ASRock, but Aorus and Asus and all of them, whereas the Founders Edition card is only an 8 gigabyte card. So yeah, it's kind of interesting that there's two memory allocations you got to pick from on 4060 Ti, but this one here, right in the middle, 12 gigs, just 12 gigabytes, which would be plenty, I think, for most games. Now, one of their generational uplifts that they show here, I know they're trying to show people that are on cards are maybe 4 or 5 years old at this point, but they're kind of showing the uplift between the 5700 XT and the 2070 Super. I think the 2070 Super was a weird card to sort of pick, but they're just showing, I guess some of those cards don't hit 60 FPS in certain titles, especially modern titles. I'm gonna throw that chart out. What's interesting here is the 4070 12 gigabyte versus the 7800 XT 16 gig. Okay, so if we look at their comparison chart, and this is the charts when I say kind of take it with a grain of salt, we are seeing across a test suite that's got RT on and RT off and all sorts of different titles, we're seeing a lot of performance benefit to the 7800 XT versus the 4070 based on their testing. These are the max settings and stuff. Notably, it loses by 18% in Doom Eternal with RT on. We know that if a title is compared in RT, NVIDIA is going to have a huge advantage because they're on their 3rd generation of RT core, and AMD is only on their 2nd. But some of these titles have RT on, like Resident Evil 4, Far Cry 6. Now, if it's an AMD sponsored title, you're probably going to see some enhancements and some optimizations there, which, let's face it, NVIDIA does the very same thing. We're seeing at the Callisto protocol dead even at 0%, but we're seeing up to 23% of performance advantage for the 7800 XT over the 4070 based on their testing. I just wish, instead of showing percentage, I wish they would have shown absolute values. It doesn't say on the chart here necessarily that FSR was on or anything like that. I hope that this is FSR off. Like if it was FSR on, they would have had to compare to DLSS. It doesn't say on this chart how they did that. So that's stuff you have to look for in the review. If we move on to the 7700 XT 12 gig versus the 4060 Ti 16 gig, now that's where you know they're confident. Because realistically, the 7700 XT 12 gig they're comparing that they have is their Founders Edition card, which, you know, the Founders card, whatever they're calling it for AMD, but they're comparing it to the custom 16 gigabyte cards that are only available from AIBs and not NVIDIA's card. So if they were gonna compare it to the Founders Edition NVIDIA, that would be the 8 gigabyte card, which would show even more limitations. So this to me sounds like they're extremely confident, because if you look at this chart, they only lose in 2 titles. That's F123 with ray tracing at medium, and it was 5% slower, and Doom Eternal with ray tracing on, which is 9% slower. Shadow of the Tomb Raider and Spider-Man Miles Morales with RT very high, dead even at 0%. And then with Dying Light RT on, a 1% performance advantage. Forza Horizon 5 with RT Extreme, a 2% performance advantage. And then from Counter-Strike Global Offensive all the way up to Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2, it's anywhere from 9% to 31% speed advantage or performance advantage, 7700 XT over 4060 Ti. These are at 1440p settings, so you can't even say the 8 gigabyte had anything to do with it because they use the 16 gigabyte card. So the 7700 XT coming in at $449 is a huge, huge incentive to go with the 7700 XT if these numbers hold true, versus the 4060 Ti 16 gigabyte card, which is running $500 and up. So if you wanted to price comparison these cards, to be fair, if we're looking at price as the ultimate deciding factor, then you should be comparing a 4060 Ti 16 gig to a 7800 XT, because they're the same price. Now that's the AMD card, it's $500. The custom cards will probably cost a little more than that. So this is the first time we see them directly compare anything to the 4070 in terms of like hard values, and that's because they've really zeroed in on the memory the memory speeds. So the 4070 is a 192-bit bus, 12 gigabytes, 7800 XT, 16 gigabytes, 256-bit bus, 624 gigabytes per second versus 504 gigabytes per second. So it's faster memory. And the 7700 XT is the exact same story at 432 gigabytes per second versus 288 on the 4060 Ti. So that memory speed is probably where you're seeing a lot of that performance, greater performance over NVIDIA at that tier than the 7800 XT, just because of the memory speed alone, more than likely. But anyway, the rest of the game, they go on in the rest of the deck to talk about FSR and the performance uplift there, and they're at FSR 2.1 now. So I'm not gonna talk about that. I'm just gonna kind of give you some of my thoughts moving forward here. Typically what AMD would do in the past, and I even said this to them on the phone, is they would launch a new card as close to NVIDIA pricing as they could, and then to gain market share over time, over the next few months, they would lower the price of the card so people would then adopt the card. And I feel like that's a disingenuous model. I feel like that's squeezing people with more money for money up front and then lowering the price to make it more affordable for people. This time around, they just went, what's the bottom dollar we can sell it for? Hopefully remain profitable, because if it's not, this will not continue. $499 for the 7800 XT. It's just, I can't imagine anybody at that price point shopping for a 4070, which is going to cost significantly $100 more at least, because that $599, that's the founder's card price. When you start looking at custom models, they only go up from there. So saving $100 and getting potentially more performance, that's something I think everyone could get behind. Now, I feel like the 7700 XT might be priced a little too close to the 7800 at only $50 less. However, $50 is still $50. And if it's giving you the types of performance over the 4060 Ti 16 gig model that we're seeing on these charts, then AMD has a winner on their hands as far as I'm concerned. Again, we have to test all of this ourselves. And I'm sure that you guys are gonna have a lot of different channels bringing out performance stuff. September 6th, I believe, is when things are gonna be available for embargo stuff. So you gotta wait a couple more weeks. But with that said, I'm gonna go ahead and hop on out of here. I just wanted to kind of give you the news from Gamescom that it looks like AMD at this price point is going to be a bit dominant. We just need people to adopt. And the reason why I say that is I still think a lot of people are skittish when it comes to buying AMD. That's because of driver history, just game compatibility or weirdness that would happen with AMD graphics cards. But it's gotten a whole lot better over time. All right, guys, thanks for watching. That's the latest. Are you convinced? Are these charts enough? Brand presented charts should always be taken with a grain of salt, but is this enough to even persuade you to consider buying an AMD graphics card, or are you still gonna consider a 4060 Ti or a 4070 no matter what? Sound off down below, guys, and as always, we'll see you in the next one.